What if everything you've been hearing about Shedeur Sanders isn't the full story? Because right now, the conversation around him feels loud, but also strangely one-sided. Every time his name comes up, it's the same talking points: completion percentage, turnovers, limited reps. It's like the narrative has already been decided before anyone even looks deeper. And that's where things start to feel off. Because football isn't played on stat sheets, it's played on film. And when you actually slow things down and watch what's happening play by play, you start noticing things that don't get mentioned nearly enough. The timing, the decision-making, the way he processes the field. Those details don't always show up in headlines, but they matter more than anything at the quarterback position. And here's the part that makes this even more interesting. When people inside the game, guys who actually play the position, start looking at that same film, the conversation changes. It's not about surface-level numbers anymore. It's about what's really happening between the snap and the throw. And suddenly, the story doesn't sound the same. So now the question is just, how is he performing? Are we even looking at the right things? Because once you start digging deeper, the narrative might not just be incomplete. It might be completely off. It feels like every time Shedeur Sanders is brought up, the conversation is already decided before it even begins. You hear the same things repeated over and over again: completion percentage, interceptions, lack of first-team reps. It's like a checklist of negatives that gets recycled daily, no matter what actually happens on the field. And after a while, that kind of coverage starts to shape perception. Because when people hear something enough times, they stop questioning it. It just becomes the narrative. But here's the issue. That narrative feels incomplete. Because while those stats get highlighted constantly, there's very little attention given to the context behind them. How often was he under pressure? What kind of protection was he working with? How many of those situations were actually favorable for a young quarterback still adjusting to the system? Those questions don't get asked nearly enough. Instead, everything gets simplified into numbers. And numbers don't always tell the full story. For example, when people bring up completion percentage, they rarely talk about decision-making. Was he forcing throws, or was he taking what the defense gave him? Was he avoiding risky plays or chasing highlights? Because those details matter way more than a percentage on paper. The same goes for turnovers. Interceptions get labeled quickly, but not all interceptions are the same. Some come from miscommunication, some from pressure, some from situations where the quarterback is forced to make something happen. But once it hits the stat sheet, it's all treated the same. And that's where things start to feel unbalanced. Because instead of breaking down why things are happening, the focus stays on what happened, and that leaves out half the story. Now, to be fair, criticism is part of the game. Every quarterback deals with it. That's not new, but what makes this situation stand out is how one-sided it feels. It's not just critique, it's repetition. And when repetition replaces analysis, the conversation stops evolving. That's what we're seeing here. Because while the surface-level narrative continues to focus on flaws, there's a completely different conversation happening underneath, one that's based on film, not just stats. And that gap between perception and reality, that's where things start to get interesting. Because once you move past the headlines and actually look at what's happening snap by snap, you might realize the criticism isn't wrong, but it's definitely not complete. But then a completely different perspective enters the conversation, and suddenly everything feels less certain. Because while the media continues to focus on surface-level numbers, someone who actually plays the position steps in and looks at something else entirely. The film. When Derek Carr sat down and broke down Shedeur Sanders on tape, the tone shifted immediately. This wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about stats. It was about what actually happens between the snap and the throw. And that's where things started to change. Because instead of pointing out flaws first, Carr focused on growth, progress, the small details that don't always get noticed unless you've played the position yourself. He talked about how Sanders is trending upward, how he's learning from mistakes, and most importantly, how he's not repeating them. That alone says a lot. Because one of the biggest indicators of a quarterback's future isn't perfection, it's adjustment. The ability to see something once, learn from it, and not let it happen again. And according to Carr's breakdown, that's exactly what Sanders is doing. But it didn't stop there. Carr also pointed out improvements in movement, how Sanders is becoming more comfortable in the pocket, stepping up instead of drifting, using his legs when necessary instead of forcing throws. These are subtle things, but they're critical at the NFL level. They show awareness. They show development. And most importantly, they show control. Now here, where the gap becomes obvious. Because while this kind of analysis is happening on one side, detailed, technical, rooted in experience, the public narrative on the other side is still focused on numbers and outcomes. Two completely different conversations. One based on results, the other based on process. And in football, process is what leads to results. That's what makes this so important. Because when someone like Carr, who understands exactly what it takes to succeed at that position, looks at Sanders and sees improvement, composure, and decision-making, it forces you to reconsider everything else you've been hearing. It doesn't mean the criticism disappears, but it does mean the story becomes more complicated and maybe more accurate. Because if the film is showing growth, confidence, and awareness, then the question isn't whether Sanders has potential. It's whether people are actually paying attention to it. And this is where the conversation really starts to flip. Because once you get into the film, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Shedeur Sanders makes smart decisions. Not flashy decisions, not risky, highlight-chasing plays. Smart ones. When Derek Carr was breaking down the tape, one of the biggest things he pointed out wasn't arm talent or athleticism, it was how Sanders processes the field, the way he moves through his reads, the way he doesn't panic when the first option isn't there. And that's a big deal. Because a lot of young quarterbacks struggle with that. They lock onto their first read. They force throws that aren't there. They try to make something happen instead of letting the play develop. But that's not what shows up here. Instead, you see Sanders drop back, scan the field, and make a choice based on what the defense gives him. If the first option isn't open, he moves on. If the second option isn't clean, he doesn't force it. He takes the check down. And that might sound simple, but it's not. Because taking the check down requires discipline, it requires patience. It requires a level of maturity that a lot of quarterbacks don't develop until much later in their careers. It means you're not chasing the big play, you're staying on schedule. And that's how offenses stay alive. Carr even highlighted moments where Sanders recognized that nothing downfield was worth the risk, so he calmly took the safe option and turned it into a positive play. No panic, no hesitation, just clean decision-making. That's quarterbacking. And here's the part that gets overlooked. Those decisions don't show up in highlight reels. Nobody clips a perfect checkdown. Nobody goes viral for avoiding a bad throw. But those are the exact plays that separate good quarterbacks from reckless ones. Because it's not just about what you do, it's about what you don't do. And Sanders is showing that he understands that early. Now, does that mean everything is perfect? Of course not. There are still moments to clean up, still areas to grow, but the foundation, the way he sees the field, the way he processes information, that's already there. And that's what makes this so important. Because decision-making is one of the hardest things to teach at the quarterback position. Arm strength can improve, mechanics can be refined. But processing, that's instinct. And right now, the film suggests that Sanders has it. Which raises a bigger question. If the decision-making is already this solid, what happens when everything else around him catches up? And this is where things really start to separate casual takes from real understanding, because the most important plays Shedeur Sanders is making aren't the flashy ones. They're the quiet ones. The ones nobody clips, the ones nobody debates, the ones that don't show up on highlight reels but quietly win games. When Derek Carr was breaking down the film, one thing stood out immediately: Sanders isn't forcing the game. He's not trying to be a hero on every snap. He's not chasing the big play just to prove a point. He's playing within the moment. There were multiple situations where the downfield options weren't clean, routes covered, windows tight, and instead of trying to squeeze the ball into a risky spot, Sanders made the smarter choice. He checked it down. Now, to some people, that might look boring. It might look like he's playing it safe. But in reality, that's one of the hardest things for a young quarterback to do. Because the temptation is always there. You want to make the big throw, you want to create a highlight, you want to prove you belong, but doing that too often leads to mistakes, turnovers, missed opportunities, stalled drives. Sanders is avoiding that trap. He's choosing control over chaos. And that matters more than people realize. Because football isn't about winning one play, it's about staying ahead of the chains, keeping the offense moving, setting up the next opportunity. And those small, smart decisions, they're what keep everything on track. Carr even pointed out how quickly Sanders recognizes when a play isn't there. No hesitation, no second guessing, just a quick reset and a clean decision to take what's available. That's not passive, that's efficient. And here's the part that gets overlooked the most. Those decisions don't just prevent mistakes, they build trust. Coaches trust you to run the system, teammates trust you to keep the offense alive, and most importantly, the game slows down for you because you're not constantly trying to force it. That's how quarterbacks grow. Not by chasing perfection, but by managing situations. And right now, that's exactly what Sanders is showing. He understands that every play doesn't need to be spectacular. Sometimes, the best decision is the simplest one. And when a young quarterback already has that mindset, that's not a weakness, that's a foundation. But this is where things really start to separate perception from reality. Because when you look at Shedeur Sanders on film, one trait keeps showing up over and over again. Accuracy under pressure. And not just basic throws, not easy completions. We are talking about tight window passes, collapsing pockets, and moments where everything around him is breaking down, but the ball still ends up exactly where it needs to be. That's not luck. That's control. When Derek Carr was going through the tape, one of the things he kept highlighting was how clean the ball comes out of Sanders' hand, even when the situation isn't clean at all. There are plays where the protection starts to collapse, defenders are closing in, and instead of panicking, Sanders stays composed. He plants, he delivers, and the throw lands on target. That's a high-level trait. Because most young quarterbacks don't handle pressure like that. When things start to break down, mechanics usually follow. Footwork gets messy, throws lose accuracy, decisions speed up. But here, you're seeing the opposite. You're seeing a quarterback who can stay balanced even when everything around him is. And that's where the dime throws come in. There are multiple moments on film where Sanders fits the ball into tight windows, throws that require timing, anticipation, and confidence. Not just seeing the receiver open, but trusting the throw before the window fully develops. That's advanced. Because in the NFL, waiting until someone is wide open is already too late. You have to throw with expectation, not confirmation. And Sanders is already showing flashes of that ability. Now, does he hit every throw perfectly? No. No quarterback does. But what stands out is how often he gets it right despite the circumstances, despite pressure, despite timing issues, despite everything moving faster than it should. And that's what makes this so important. Because accuracy isn't just about mechanics, it's about composure. It's about being able to execute when things aren't ideal, when the pocket isn't perfect, when the play isn't clean, when you don't have time to reset and think. That's when real quarterbacks separate themselves. And right now, the film is showing that Sanders has that ability. Which leads to a bigger question. If he can deliver like this when everything around him is unstable, what happens when the situation finally works with him instead of against him? Now let's talk about the biggest criticism, and probably the most damaging one. The idea that Shedeur Sanders can't read defenses. You've probably heard it before. Analysts questioning his ability to recognize coverages, doubts about whether he can process the field at an NFL level. It's one of those narratives that sounds serious, and once it sticks, it's hard to shake. But here's the problem. When you actually look at the film, that claim doesn't hold up the way people think it does. And this is exactly where Derek Carr's breakdown becomes important. Because instead of guessing, he's pointing out real examples, moments where Sanders is doing exactly what critics say he can't do. You see him at the line of scrimmage, identifying the defense, adjusting, communicating, making sure everyone is aligned before the ball is even snapped. That's step one. Then after the snap, it continues. You see his eyes working, scanning, moving from one read to the next. He's not locked in on a single option. He's reacting to what the defense shows him and adjusting in real time. That's not hesitation. That's processing. And there's a big difference. Because struggling quarterbacks look confused, their eyes freeze, their decisions come late, everything feels rushed and uncertain. But that's not what shows up here. Instead, you see a quarterback who understands what he's looking at, even if the play doesn't always end perfectly. And that's an important distinction, because reading a defense correctly doesn't guarantee a big play. It just puts you in the right position to make one. Now, to be fair, this doesn't mean he's flawless. There are still moments where things can be cleaner, faster, more consistent. That's part of development. Every young quarterback goes through that phase. But saying he can't read defenses, that's a stretch. Because the film shows the opposite. It shows a player who's already handling pre-snap recognition, post-snap adjustments, and communication at a level that most rookies are still trying to reach. And when you combine that with his decision-making and accuracy, it starts to paint a very different picture than what's being pushed publicly. So now the question changes. It's not, can he read defenses? It's, why does the narrative say he can't when the film shows that he can? Because once you see that disconnect, it makes you wonder what else might be getting overlooked. And that's where this story really starts to shift. But here's the part that changes everything, and it's the one detail that keeps getting overlooked. Time. Not talent, not effort, not ability. Time in the pocket. Because when you really break down Shedeur Sanders on film, there's a pattern that shows up over and over again. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. When he has time, everything works. The reads are clean, the footwork is controlled, the ball comes out on time, the offense flows exactly how it's supposed to. You see confidence, you see rhythm, you see a quarterback fully in control of what's happening. But when that time disappears, everything speeds up. The pocket collapses faster than expected. Pressure starts creeping in from the edges. And now, instead of working through a full progression, decisions have to be made instantly, not because he wants to rush, but because he has to. And that changes everything. Because quarterbacking is built on timing. Routes are designed to hit at specific moments. Reads are meant to develop in sequence. But when protection breaks down early, that entire structure falls apart. Now it's not about running the offense, it's about surviving the play. And that's where mistakes can happen. Not because the quarterback doesn't understand what he's seeing, but because he doesn't have the time to let it fully develop. Even Derek Carr touched on this in his breakdown. He pointed out how different Sanders looks when the pocket is stable, how much more comfortable he becomes when he knows he can step into a throw without worrying about immediate pressure. That confidence matters, because once a quarterback starts expecting pressure, even when it's not there, it changes how he plays. Footwork speeds up, reads get rushed, trust starts to fade. And for a young quarterback, that's one of the hardest things to overcome. Now, to be fair, this isn't an excuse, it's context. Every quarterback deals with pressure, that's part of the NFL, but what matters is recognizing how much that pressure is impacting performance. And in this case, it's significant. Because the difference between a clean pocket and a collapsing one isn't small. It's everything. So now the conversation shifts again. Instead of asking, why is he inconsistent? You start asking, what does he look like when he actually has the time to operate? Because if the answer to that question is what the film suggests, calm, accurate, and in control, then this isn't just about evaluating a player. It's about understanding the situation around him. And once you see that clearly, the entire narrative starts to change. And this is where everything finally comes together, because once you step back and look at the full picture, one thing becomes clear. Context changes everything. Because it's easy to judge a quarterback based on numbers. It's easy to point at percentages, interceptions, or missed plays and build a narrative around that. But football doesn't happen in isolation. Every play is influenced by everything happening around the quarterback. Protection, play design, receiver execution, timing. All of it matters. And when you look at Shedeur Sanders through that lens, the story starts to shift. Because suddenly, those inconsistencies don't look as random anymore. They start to line up with situations, moments where the pocket breaks down early, plays where routes don't fully develop, situations where he's forced to react instead of execute. And that's a completely different conversation. Because now, instead of asking, why isn't he performing? You're asking, what is he being asked to work with? And that distinction matters more than anything. Even in Derek Carr's breakdown, you can hear it indirectly. The emphasis on timing, on rhythm, on how the offense looks when things are working the way they're supposed to. Because when those pieces are in place, Sanders doesn't look overwhelmed. He looks comfortable. He looks composed. He looks like a quarterback who understands exactly what he's doing. And that's the part that gets lost when everything is reduced to stats. Because stats don't show pressure in your face 2 seconds after the snap. They don't show routes breaking late or spacing being off. They don't show the split-second decisions that come from trying to make something out of a broken play. But the film does. And the film tells a more complete story. Now, this doesn't mean everything is perfect. There are still areas to improve. That's true for every young quarterback. Growth is part of the process. But what context does is change how you evaluate that growth. Instead of seeing flaws as limitations, you start seeing them as situations, as moments that can improve once the environment improves. And that's a big difference. Because one suggests a ceiling, the other suggests potential. So now the conversation shifts one more time. It's not just about what Sanders has done so far. It's about what he can become when everything around him starts to align the way it's supposed to. And once you see it that way, you're not just watching a quarterback struggle. You're watching one develop. So when you take everything into account, the stats, the film, the context, the breakdown from Derek Carr, the real story around Shedeur Sanders starts to look very different. Because this isn't a finished product. It's a work in progress. And that's exactly what makes it so interesting. Right now, the public conversation feels rushed. Labels are being applied early. Opinions are forming quickly. And in some cases, it feels like people are trying to decide what he is before he's even had the chance to fully develop. But football doesn't work like that. Quarterbacks don't arrive fully formed. They grow, they adjust, they improve through reps, experience, and stability. And when you look at Sanders through that lens, what you're seeing isn't a player struggling to keep up. You're seeing one learning how to take control. The decision-making is there, the accuracy is showing up, the ability to read defenses is developing. And most importantly, the growth is visible. That's the key. Because it's one thing to have talent, it's another to show improvement, to fix mistakes, to adapt week after week. And according to the film, that's exactly what's happening here. Now, does that mean everything is perfect? Not even close. There are still areas that need to improve. There are still moments that need to be cleaner, faster, more consistent. But that's not a red flag, that's the process. Every young quarterback goes through it. The difference is how they respond to it. And right now, Sanders is responding the right way. But here's the part that should really make you think. If this is what he looks like while dealing with pressure, inconsistency, and constant criticism, if this is the version of him we're seeing under less than ideal conditions, then what happens when things finally stabilize? When the protection improves, when the system fully settles, when the reps become consistent. Because that's when quarterbacks take real jumps. That's when everything starts to slow down. And that's when the narrative usually changes. So maybe the real question is whether Shedeur Sanders is good enough. Maybe it's whether people are judging him too early, before the full story has even had a chance to play out. Because if the film is telling the truth, then this story, it's just getting started.